When I first got the invite to come and talk here, I sort of had a hard time figuring out exactly what I was going to have to say about the relationship between web science and the mind. I've thought a whole lot about minds. I've thought almost nothing about the web, aside from, as we all do, using it. But as I sat and thought a little bit, I realized that there had been a couple of interesting issues that border on things that I've been concerned about for a while, where people had at least talked about web use as, and what it does to our thinking. So that's going to be the target of my discussion in this talk, is trying to make sense of what sort of thing a mind is that's hooked up and linked up with web use, and whether we ever find ourselves in a situation where the web extends the mind in an interesting way. Now, I've been in disputes for a while now with folks, some of whom are in this room, about the possibility of collective mentality. That is, mentality that's shared between multiple individuals. And I've argued, also like a few of the folks who are philosophers in this room, that some form of cognitive integration is the sort of key and crucial thing that needs to be present in order for the mind to be extended or distributed amongst multiple different components. But I think, unlike some of the other philosophers that I've disputed with, I've got really fairly traditional views about what an explanation amounts to in the cognitive sciences. A lot of folks that talk about the distribution or extension of cognition tend to prefer views that are less heavily focused on issues of representation and on the way that integrated representational systems are responsible for the guidance of flexible, goal-directed behavior. And really, that's been my focus in both my sort of work in cognitive psychology and in philosophy. It's been an attempt to try and figure out how integrated networks of representational systems operate together collectively to guide goal-directed, system-level behavior. And what I want to try and do today is to try and say something interesting, I hope, about what it takes for integration of cognition to occur in a way that crosses the boundaries between brain, body, and world. Now, the term macrocognition, it's interestingly has two sorts of uses that I wasn't aware of until fairly recently. The original use of the term comes from Gary Klein and his colleagues. And what they've been interested in, they're organizational psychologists mostly, what they've been interested in is the way that naturalistic decision-making takes place in real-world environments, where people can rely on various forms of social scaffolding, where they can rely on one another in teams, where they can rely on various sorts of tools and technologies that happen to be laying about and around them in their ordinary, everyday, lived environments. Now, what distinguishes this sort of project from a lot of the stuff that's gone on in the heuristics and biases literature is that these folks, in an interesting way, aren't particularly concerned with cognitive mechanisms. What they're concerned with is specifying in relatively functional terms that are sort of start from task analyses the relationship between mental activities as they occur in individuals, in teams, without thinking too much about what the underlying mechanistic stable structures are that facilitate that sort of behavior or decision making. Now, unbeknownst to me, when I wrote a recent book called Macrocognition, I sort of had been developing a view that is in a sense, exactly the opposite sort of view that these folks are working on, though there's a lot of affinity. What I'm concerned with, and what I've been concerned with, is a sort of microcognitive approach that's sort of been upsized and embiggened. What I'm concerned with is the way in which various tools and techniques that have been used for a long time in cognitive psychology can be scaled up to look at systems that are larger than individuals, that are nonetheless relying on the same sorts of mechanistic and neurocomputational sorts of projects to give us a sense of how cognitive integration occurs across the boundaries between people. Now, one way of thinking about this difference between these two sorts of projects is that the older sort of project is concerned with the specification of the tasks that are carried out by individuals or by teams. I'm more concerned with an account of how subpersonal cognitive psychological mechanisms implement and guide that sort of human-level, person-level, system-level behavior. And one of the things that I think is really interesting that's gone on in the philosophical disputes and the theoretical disputes about extended cognition is I think that in a lot of cases, people aren't careful to keep distinct these two kinds of explanatory projects. In many cases, they take themselves to be offering something that's consistent with the cognitive psychology or with the projects that show up in cognitive psychology, while nonetheless relying on fairly abstract, functionally specified task analyses to make sense of the phenomena at hand. And what I want to begin with is sort of sketching out a place where these two sorts of projects have been conflated in an interesting way that was some of the sort of initial research that got me excited about the possibility of the distribution of individual cognition between multiple people. And this is research that was originally started by Dan Wegner in the 1980s on the way that memory systems end up often being distributed between multiple individuals. And Wegner starts from a relatively intuitive case. He starts from the case of an old couple who has spent every day of their lives together for the last however many years, who find themselves engaged often in a practice of remembering things together, of thinking about their past, of relying on one another to fully flesh out and fully specify the memories that they share with one another. Now, what Wegner suggests is that in this case of the old couple who remember together, what you find is a sort of functional specialization, where one member of the couple will remember certain classes of facts, the other member of the couple will remember other classes of facts, and then on top of that, they'll remember who remembers what, in a sense, generating an interacting cognitive system that constitutes something like a collective memory structure. Now, what he did, and what I think is really super interesting and what got me excited about this stuff, is he showed experimentally that exactly this sort of phenomena shows up, and shows up in couples that have been together for a really short time, for a matter of maybe a year at the top. What he did was he brought couples into the lab and presented them with sets of terms from different categories that they were supposed to remember. In some cases, he let couples who had been together for a while work together. In other cases, he split them up and put people who were unfamiliar with one another in the same situation. Now, the second riff on this was, in some of these cases, he presented people with a list of the items that they should focus on. So, in a sense, giving people the functional specialization that it would allow them to remember the items. So, he would tell one partner, you remember the automobiles, the fruit, and the jobs. You remember the people's names, the locations, and whatever, some other third category. Now, what he found, and this is the striking result, is that the group that succeeded in remembering the most items with the least overlap was the couple who had been together for a while, who was not told what to focus on. Next best were the unfamiliar people who were given the list of categories that they should focus on. And the absolute worst, with the most overlap and the least success in the task, were the couple who'd been together for a year and who were told what items they ought to be focusing on. Wegner suggests that what's happening here is you're generating interference in the system. What you're doing is you're presenting people with a functional specialization that's utterly alien to the memory tasks that these couples are used to working on and used to working on together. By generating that cognitive interference, what you do is you shut down their standard memory capacities, and you swamp them by giving them a distractor task. So what he suggests is, in this case, you've got a collective memory system that can be compromised by imposing that additional task on the couple, not on the individuals as such. Now, Wegner goes on to suggest in a later paper that there's more sort of phenomenological evidence for the fact that we remember collectively in this way. And the evidence that he appeals to is the fact that when you lose a partner that you've been with for a long time, what you find yourself with is the feeling of knowing, that you sort of have a memory of some event or some occurrence, but you're unable to bring to mind the information that's kicking around there. And on this basis, what he suggests is that the organization of these transactive memory systems, as he calls them, depends on the functional specialization and a set of metamemories that indicate where particular information is stored. Sometimes you can end up with a situation where the metamemory fails to find the location where the information happens to be stored. And on this basis, in a 1995 paper, Wegner goes on to try and spell out in relatively, he thinks, computational terms, an account of how this system works. Now, I think what's important to remember here, and what's important to note here, is that his articulation of this sketch of a story is incredibly abstract, it's incredibly coarse-grained, and it's not at all clear that he's necessarily got a good account of the way that networks function or that individual minds function or anything else of the sort. But here's roughly the story. He claims that memories are stored in associative networks with topical encoding. Retrieval then relies on metamemories to access the relevant location where the memories are stored. Those memories designate the storage locations. And the big hunch is that the location where a memory is stored need not be the same location as where the metamemory is stored, neurally speaking. Instead, I can have metamemories that refer to the storage locations in another person's brain. My metamemory can refer to the memories that are stored by my partner. The hunch in the case of individual memory is that in the same way, when we look at how individuals remember, we find that their memory is topically organized, that it's functionally specified, and that it's largely associative, and that it relies on some sort of metamemories to search. As I noted before, the story is then that you link up two brains to generate a system that crosses the boundaries between skin and skull. The thought is that we have a metamemory system that consists of multiple individuals. Now, I think that this sort of picture has a lot of value, and you can get a lot of traction for it in arguing for the spatial distribution of memory. But the fact that this was a completely abstractly specified picture was driven home to me when last year, right before he passed away, Wegner published a pair of papers where he argued that essentially the web or the iPhone Siri can function in exactly the same way that a transactive memory partner does. So he says that inviting the iPhone Siri into one's social group changes everything. They find that people treat the internet much like they would a human transactive memory partner. We offload memories to the cloud just as readily as we would to a family member, a friend, or a lover. The internet, in another sense, is also unlike a human transactive memory partner. It knows more and can produce this information more quickly. What they found in a series of experiments that he's referring to here is that people have the tendency to remember only those things that they won't have access to. Otherwise, they just remember where to look. So first, in a priming study, what they found is that people reflexively think about computers after they're presented with hard questions that they don't know how to answer. And the assumption on the basis of that data is that people have meta-memories, or meta-representations, that have started to designate computers as storage locations. Second, they found that when you present people with a set of facts to remember, if people believe that they're going to have access to a search engine or to a database that includes that information, they don't tend to remember the things that they believe will be available later using the search engine or using the database. On the basis of this, Wegner suggests that we don't encode information that's going to be available to us at a later point. This shows us that we functionally specialize. We remember only those things that we think are going to be necessary to get around in the world. And finally, they suggest that since Google and since the internet is becoming ubiquitous in our life, they claim that we are becoming symbiotic with our computer tools. They claim that we're growing into interconnected systems that remember less by knowing information than by knowing where the information can be found. Now, I think it's utterly undeniable, given especially some of the stuff that we just saw in the most recent talk, that we exploit the internet as an epistemic resource, that we forage through it, that we use it to find various kinds of rewards and exciting things. We use our smartphones to get around unfamiliar cities. We use Google to quiet interpersonal disputes. And some of us spend far too many hours looking for the hippest and most exciting underground restaurants. The web functions for us as a tool. And I think that we have to recognize that our web use modifies our inferential landscape, allowing us to exploit context-specific information in ways that allow us to simplify problem solving. But there's something a little bit odd about thinking about the way that we use our iPhones, that we use the internet, as part of an extended cognitive system. Internet use has modified our inferential landscape, but it's also clear that our Google searches might, for example, query ultimately, our Google queries ultimately might be querying some server, some database in Helsinki. And it's a little bit odd to think about a person's mind extending through their iPhone to Helsinki to build a widely distributed cognitive system of that sort. On the one hand, when somebody walks out into traffic as they're looking at their phone, not paying attention to what's going on, it's the person who's made a mistake. Same thing when one of my students relies too heavily on a poorly edited Wikipedia page or on SparkNotes for one of the papers that they turn into me, not thinking about whether they should be accepting the things that are presented to them or not. The person seems to be the responsible system, regardless of what they do with the tools. Furthermore, once we start extending cognition to things like the servers in Helsinki, it's hard to understand why we shouldn't treat the coffee that supercharges my cognition, that supercharges my neurons, as part of me as a cognitive system. Without that, I would be utterly at sea. If I didn't drink 15 cups of coffee a day, I would be unlikely to ever finish a paper, unlikely to ever give a talk. And we need to think, I think, about what the boundaries are between cognitive systems, how they interact, how they organize, if we want to understand how information flows through them, if we want to understand how they're integrated, how they produce flexible, goal-directed behavior. That might not be a problem if what you're concerned with is the metaphysics of cognition, but if you want to actually do the psychology and you want to engage in the experimental tasks that allow us to figure out how cognition works in distributed systems, we need to figure out some way to draw boundaries, and it's unclear that this sort of model, as abstract as it is, gives us any clear account of how to do that. Now, what I want to suggest is that we do better in thinking about these questions about the distribution of cognition and about the possibility that the web use extends the mind by starting from a simple recognition that a plausible account of social cognition needs and presupposes something internal that explains how and why people can learn to talk, form elaborate societies, draw up biographies, whereas dogs and trees cannot. I think there's been a tendency in the discussions of extended cognition, of the discussions of collective memory, to sort of start at the end of the story, to see that cognition is necessarily situated, to see that it's necessarily embedded in a social world, to see that in some cases it necessarily depends on these functionally specified arrangements of people. And from that...
Sorry to interrupt you. You have a very wonderful, robust voice. Could you turn the volume down a bit?
I am sorry about that.
Just a bit.
Better?
Well, we'll see.
Yeah. How about I move that down a bit too? All right. Let's see how that goes. Sorry about that. I know I tend to be very loud. Okay, so there's been a tendency among people working on these issues of extended cognition, working on issues of collective memory, to start at the end of the story, to start from functionally characterized task analyses, and from that to infer the presence of an informationally integrated system. I think that what we need to do is to instead start from the beginning of the story, and to start by thinking about how individual animals come to exploit or come to be integrated with the world around them. And that's what I want to do in the rest of the talk, is to try and say something about how individual animals construct memories and engage in planning in a way that might sometimes end up with a full-fledged distribution of mentality, with a full-fledged existence of collective planning and collective memory. I think that in almost every case, when we think about the way that we get around our social world, it helps to remember a little insight from Herbert Simon's Sciences of the Artificial. And that's a story about the ant walking along the beach, showing a really complex pattern of walking across the beach back to its home. When we think about that, we can either pack the complex movement and the way that it's guided into the ant's head. We can give it lots of representational resources. We can think of it as an incredibly smart system that's finding its way around all sorts of complicated structures. Or we can recognize that much of the information that's salient is left by the ant in the environment. It's exploited when it's necessary, but otherwise utterly ignored by the ant. Now, until fairly recently, and still in many parts of cognitive psychology, there's been the assumption that we need to think of most of human social cognition in terms that depend on a massively complex and functionally specified set of tools that are dedicated to particular kinds of tasks, that depend on particular facts about our evolutionary history. I don't want to deny that there are some of those there. But I think that in a lot of cases, we do better to think of the human mind in a way that parallels the sort of thinking that we see in the actions of the superhero Angus MacGyver. What MacGyver did was carried around a few simple tools that allowed him to exploit general purpose tools, that allowed him to exploit the other things that happened to be laying around in his environment in order to navigate unexpected and unforeseen situations. I think that when we think about how individuals remember, it helps to recognize that we find ourselves in a situation where often we can't remember everything that goes on in the world. And often what goes on in the world is utterly irrelevant to us. In a sense, it seems, given the recent research in the cognitive science of memory, that what we rely on is skeletal representations. We encode abstractions. We encode representations that don't fully specify the structure of the world. We rely on just-based representations. Our environment is informationally rich, but at the same time, encoding all of the information that's relevant about our world would take too long, would impose too high of processing demands, and so what we do is encode only a gist of the situation. And then we find various ways of elaborating and fleshing out that gist-based representation. The full-blooded contents of our everyday representations are shaped and supported by their skeletal contents. But they can be fleshed out and enlivened through many sorts of influences, some of which happen to be internal, some of which happen to be external. All of the recent research on what memory is, neurologically speaking, points to the hypothesis that memory relies on skeletally encoded representations, which are then fleshed out using things like counterfactual reasoning. The initial push in this direction came from Bartlett in really early work, showing that when you present people with surreal stories and ask them to remember them, what you find is that over time, the surreal aspects of the story get dropped out and get replaced with things that are more familiar. Ulrich Neisser beautifully showed in looking at the behavior of John Dean, who was giving testimony to the US about Richard Nixon's behavior, was supposed to have an incredibly robust and perfect memory. And he would come in and describe in vivid detail his interactions with Nixon. Little did he know that every one of those interactions had been recorded. And so it made it possible to go back and look at both what was said and how it was accurate, and what was actually said in the context of the original discussion. And what you find is, in that case, what's presented as a vivid memory are repeated episodes, things that occurred frequently, things that were easily accessible and easily available to counterfactual elaboration. There are bones that are recorded that need to be enlivened and need to be fleshed out. But as Neisser puts the point, out of a few scattered bones, we're able to, in his case, remember the whole dinosaur. In my case, remember the whole elephant, by relying on internal strategies of narrative construction and counterfactual reasoning. This suggests that perhaps memory is not necessarily for remembering. It might be something that comes along as a side. It might be something that depends instead on planning strategies and counterfactual reasoning strategies. Now, I think it's important to note that in many cases, those just-based memories don't need to be fleshed out. If I want to remember which shelf the carrots in my fridge are on, I don't need to store a memory of that. All I need to do is go and look. I need to remember where the information is stored. But in many other cases, what we rely on is information that's present in our environment as an anchor in the dynamic flow of thought. We use anchors that are scattered around our world in the practices of people we engage with frequently, in the institutional design of the rooms that we speak in and the rooms that we act in, of the space of our neighborhoods, and the way in which various sorts of strategies for thinking and remembering are embedded in our socially cultured world. We can use any physical structure as a material anchor that can trigger and promote the construction of a robust memory as a material anchor. But it's not a material, the physical structure is not a material anchor because of some intrinsic quality it has, but because of the way we come to use it. And the uses that are important for the process of planning and remembering are processes of composing things that are outside with things that are inside to construct new ideas, to figure out new ways of interacting. Strategies for completing or elaborating the skeletal representations that we've stored internally, or for completing and elaborating the structures that are stored externally. In each of these cases, what we rely on is the same process of counterfactual elaboration, the same process of fleshing out the ideas that are stored either internally or externally. Across the functionally specified task of remembering, we find a variety of different internal mechanistic structures that are sometimes exploiting external information, sometimes exploiting internal information, but always relying on the process of forward modeling, of imagining, of engaging in counterfactual reasoning. Now, a case that I find very interesting in this regard that suggests some of the really interesting ways in which memory functions as a necessarily socially instituted system, and I'll just say a bit of this in passing, is that when you think about the way that remembering worked, for example, in the Shakespearean theater, what you find is that it had to be socially scaffolded and had to be socially situated. Actors would play up to 5 different roles per week, with little overlap, playing at least one new part every week. in order to engage in a process of remembering all of those different parts and not getting them confused and not getting them to be a mess and getting them to function well in the process of presenting the narrative structure that is at issue, it seems that folks were relying on stable social and environmental scaffolding to flesh out the narratives, to rely on triggers and signals that they could use to construct a narrative on the fly without having to remember all of the details. In the same way that we use images and triggers when we give things like academic talks to help us remember how the thing is supposed to go. We don't have to remember all of the details. We don't have to remember every aspect of it. What we rely on is the triggers that are present in our world, the triggers that we've stored, to blend them together to create a narrative representation that allows us to succeed in the task that we want to carry out. Now, I think when you throw all this stuff together, we come to an important insight. And that's that we need to reject spectatorial views of cognition, views that operate as though the human mind functions independently from the world that surrounds us. Instead, what we need to adopt is a participatory framework for thinking about cognition, thinking about the way that we participate in the structure of social institutions, the structure of our material world, to construct strategies for moving about, for flexibly adapting, for engaging in goal-directed behavior, for searching, for finding ways to achieve our goals and our ends. The objects in our world and the institutions in our world can take many different forms, which nonetheless prompt for elaborate conceptual integration networks. And I think that what's super interesting is that there's a lot of evidence that's emerging now to suggest that the way in which our interaction with objects prompts for this sort of forward modeling differs radically from the way in which our interaction with individuals prompts for this sort of elaboration. The thought is that when I engage in a world that's populated by objects and institutions by myself, I operate in a mode that's determined by what I need to do to solve a task. But in my interaction with others, when I engage in a process of discussion or deliberation with another person, this pushes me into what's been called the we mode of cognition in a recent paper by Galati and Frith. They suggest that your interactions with other people trigger you to engage in a process of collaborative planning and decision-making that is not inherently exploitative, that's not designed to figure out how you can use the tools or institutions that you find in your world to succeed in your goal, but instead leads you to think of the people that you're working with as collaborators, as potential resources, as people that you can use together collaboratively to construct those same sorts of narrative representations together, using conversation, using discussion, using other various low-level sorts of signals and indications to one another to get your behaviors to align and to be directed towards a shared common goal that we achieve together. Now, there's growing evidence as well that the human capacity for metacognition bifurcates into two distinct types of metacognition. One is the sort that's necessary for learning, where across a wide variety of systems, whether they be motor learning systems, whether they be value learning systems, whatever else they happen to be, what you rely on is predictions and expectations about what the world holds, and a capacity to revise your behavior in light of the success and the failure of those predictions. This all goes on reflexively, it all goes on automatically, much of it goes on below the level of conscious recognition. But we also have the capacity for reflecting on our behavior, for storing representations of our plans and of our goals. And interestingly, what this seems to do, and what it seems to have arisen from, when you look at the most plausible evolutionary story for the evolution of this system, is it appears that it evolved for communication, for the sharing of learning strategies between multiple individuals. This sort of more slow, deliberate, and more systematic metacognition for thinking about our own behavior, thinking about our learning strategies, thinking about how to guide our action in the future, seems to be present because, or its function seems to be, to select metacognitive information from the first sort, the learning sort, for broadcast in the service of controlling the sensory motor systems of two or more agents who are involved in a shared task. Put differently, this kind of metacognitive control over your behavior, is for superpersonal cognitive control rather than for personal cognitive control. Now, I think what we can do, and this is summing up towards the end of what I want to say, I think we can embed this in a theory of planning that's been present and kicking around in the philosophy world for quite some time, to start to think about what it takes to extend and distribute cognition. So if, for example, Matthew has the intention to pull an espresso, and to pull an excellent espresso, what this does is commits him to a range of actions over the next several minutes that will constrain his behavior. It commits him to do a particular set of actions in a particular order, to arrange his environment in a way that's going to conduce to that, to engage in exactly the sorts of tasks that he's learned over the course of his interactions with others that lead to the production of a beautifully pulled shot of espresso. Now, I think that there's a similar story that holds for most forms of collective behavior. If you've got a set of factory workers who intend to stage a wildcat strike to protest pay inequalities, that's going to constrain their behavior collaboratively and collectively over the next several weeks, months, whatever it happens to be, hours. What they're going to do is their behavior is going to be constrained in a way that's grounded by mutual recognition of one another's intentions, that's grounded in common knowledge of what the rest of the workers are going to do. In this case, we have shared intentions that commit the workers to all together, leaving their stations at the same time, refusing to return to work until a suitable outcome is achieved, not crossing the picket line, etc. And those are things that only make sense as shared sorts of practices that emerge in the we mode, things that we have to do together. Now, I think in a lot of cases, the way that that works doesn't generate a fully elaborated or fully shared intention. It doesn't generate something that's socially distributed across all of the workers. Instead, what you find is that in a lot of cases like that, each of the individuals commits to a set of plans and projects that are, in some sense, the plans and projects that everyone else is engaged in. But at the same time, I think we can go back to our old couple that we started with in thinking about Wegner's work. I think that in this case, what we find is that over the course of a long period of engagement, often what you find is that the couple, or maybe a larger group, or maybe a different sort of group, becomes integrated in the sense that each of them adapts and adopts strategies that are contingent upon and integrated with the plans and projects of the individuals that they are working with, or remembering with, or planning with. I think that what we need to recognize is that the role of talking in doing things like planning from that mechanistic and computational approach. When we bring all of this together, we can start to see a way that the elaboration of distributed representations that are stored skeletally in each of a set of individuals and elaborated counterfactually through discussion, through planning, that takes place in language, in a public medium, in a way that's shared and distributed amongst all of the individuals. That generates a shared communicative structure that yields a group that can plan for its actions as such, that can rely on one another to plan, and in some cases probably to remember the things that they are doing together, that they're aiming for together, that the group is directed towards as a group. And the group as such will adapt when it fails to achieve its goals. And it'll do so because those systems for counterfactual elaboration wed the learning structures that we find in these individuals to one another in a way that distributes the role of learning and adapting to the presence of rewards, punishments, and whatever else in the environment. Okay, so what does that tell us then, thinking back to Wegner's suggestion about the possibility of treating the web or the internet or Siri as a transactive memory system, as part of a transactive memory system? Well, I think that what we find is that in a lot of cases, and this is going to be true in a lot of cases of individual cognition too, team cognition as well, that what you find is a sort of catch and toss processing, where I process ideas, pass them along to my partner, she processes them, passes them back to me, and we do that until we end up on the same page. In cases like that, I think all of the cognition ends up in each of the individuals' heads, with each of them intending to act in a way that's consistent with the goals and ideals of another person. My guess is that most of our current web use looks a lot more like that than it looks like anything collective or collaborative. I rely on the various trajectories that I find through various web networks to figure out exactly what I want to do. But then I make decisions and toss it back to the system. But there may be cases where, in the service of goals that are collectively important, goals of collectively and collaboratively changing our world, for example, developing better ways of living, or whatever it happens to be, we might find ways to use the tools that are available to us to organize shared, collective, collaborative, deliberative structures, which don't depend necessarily on what's going on in any individual, but depend on the way that the information flows through the entire system to achieve a goal that the group as such is aiming at, even if some of its individuals also happen to be engaging in that. Whether anything like this ever takes off or ever becomes plausible, I think, is an open question. I don't think we see a whole lot of it yet, but it might occur, and we might find ways of using the internet to achieve a massively distributed kind of collective intelligence, collective decision-making, and collective planning. But for now, I just think that it's important to take care to distinguish between situated and collective forms of macrocognition. So I'll stop there.